I just want to take a few minutes to just share a few things about prayer. And I think that if we got everybody together in a room that has ever experienced the power of prayer, we could all share some pretty incredible stories. I know that for myself, I wouldn't be here today if I didn't have a praying mother. In fact, I remember as a teenager growing up and I could never sneak outside of the house because in order to get out of the house, I had to walk past my mother's bedroom. And I remember so many times I would walk past her room and she would have the door open just a little bit and I would see her on her knees in front of her bed and just crying out to God for me and crying out to God for my brother. A lot of times I'd go in later to take out her trash and I would see just piles of used Kleenex and tissue there because she'd been crying and just sobbing. And I believe that my life today is a result of my mother's prayers. I think that if we're going to have an effective prayer life, a prayer life that really draws us closer to the Father and brings us into intimacy, we really need to understand three core convictions about prayer. Just three things that if we can just get a hold of, they'll change our perspective on prayer and they'll change the way that we see prayer. The first thing about prayer that we really need to understand is that God hears our prayers. And I know that sounds just super simple, and you might be rolling your eyes at me right now and thinking, yeah, no kidding. But God really does hear our prayers. So often we feel like maybe God isn't listening, or perhaps God just isn't interested in my prayers, or maybe I've worn Him out just praying the same thing over and over again. And that's just simply not true. The fact is, we might think that God responds to our prayers based on our spiritual condition or based on our spiritual resume, and we think He responds to that. Hebrews 4:16 tells us that we find mercy when we approach the throne of grace. I find that just so comforting to know that when I go and pray, what I find is not a God who looks at me and says, hey, you've got to meet prerequisites X, Y, and Z before I'll hear your prayers. Instead, we have a God that says, I have mercy for you and I want to hear your prayers. I think sometimes we fall victim to this sort of illusion of separation, and we feel like God is just way up there somewhere and we're just sending signal flares hoping that He sees them. I think sometimes we look at our prayers much like we're just sort of writing a note down on a piece of paper and we're tossing it over a wall and maybe tossing it into another cubicle, hoping that God's going to just come along and stumble upon our prayer. And that's not the case. The truth is, God hears our prayers. He hears our prayers. So when you go and pray today, I want you to have that in the forefront of your mind, that every word that you speak, every prayer that you whisper, every thought that you think in prayer, God is hearing. And not only is He hearing, He's hearing with a spirit of mercy, and He's listening to you intently because He hears your prayers.